Once again, I would like to welcome each one of you for our morning devotion, our study in the book of Proverbs, looking once more afresh, a reminder to us by our good Lord. He knows what we are and who we are and what we need for our spiritual edification. Seeing those things which would draw us away from following in the path of righteousness, God constantly reminds us through his chosen servants, the prophets, or in this case, wise men. As certainly as I said a couple of days, the wise men are wise because they receive divine wisdom, through which the wisdom that they receive from God, they are able to share it to the people of the world. For the wisdom of this world, Apostle Paul says, is foolishness. Following it may make you successful in this world, following the ways of the world. But divine wisdom alone is what can sustain us and uphold us to remain true to God's word and to enable us to walk in this path of righteousness that prepares us for his eternal kingdom. Though this message is now over 3,000 years ago, that these wise men, or even times before that, but we see the conditions of the world then and now are not too different. We can see these problems that we are facing today are about the same what people faced over 3,000 years ago. And so the wise man is telling us how we should relate to, especially in public situations, be it at a public gathering or meeting with dignitaries, or maybe at a banquet place, or wherever it may be. How should we behave? How should we relate? God is concerned about us and our life, even sometimes minute details. For the way how we act and behave tells about ourselves, and even more so, the God whom we serve. People looking at us and the way how we live, if you are a Christian, they will say, oh, this is how their religion is. But when we show them the loving character of God, that is what the world wants to see. They will say, here is someone who is living to show us God's character and whose nature is love. And so as God's people, it is so important for us, the way how we live, behave, and relate to others in terms, especially in public. And the same should be even in our homes, in private relationships. We cannot be one thing at home and another thing in the public. Sometimes this is possible. Human beings are very good at acting. That's why anybody and everybody can become an acting or an actor or an actress. They behave one way in the public and probably differently at home. Sometimes these two may not coincide. Looking at the way how we human beings live, God is telling us what truly should be our attitude in our behavior. The way how we behave reflects our attitude. And our attitude should be true. It should be transparent. with no hypocrisy or acting out. Our verses today are from chapter 25, 6 and 7. Proverbs chapter 25, verse 6 and 7, reading the word, "Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he says to you, 'Come up here,' than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince, whom your eyes have seen." We have seen similar thoughts expressed in other proverbs, but giving it a second time or a third time or repeatedly tells us the importance of the message that we are studying. This is probably part of this list of do and do nots. As the other proverbs that we have seen, telling us directly what is good to do and what is not good to do. Human nature has been so marred and changed because of sin. Before sin ever came into this earth, we could imagine how the world would have been and how human relationships had been. But sin has brought about death as the ultimate, but the changes in human relationships. Men begin to be envious of other people. Men cannot tolerate the success of others. And human beings have become all the more selfish. Self seems to be taking high priority in every individual's life. And so, what do we see? What do we hear people exalting themselves, talking high about themselves, speaking in great terms of what they have done and so on. But the wise man is telling us in very straightforward, simple terms, do not exalt yourself. This is certainly something that we need to seriously make an inventory of our own selves, to say how we are living, and not in this situation of exalting yourself, and especially in the presence of a king. There are people who like to boast, who like to tell what little good they have done in exaggerated terms, and especially in the presence of a king or a great leader or a big leader, so that they are always seeking something in return. For what little you have done, you want to receive much more in return. If you have done something good, it is not that you need to go and speak about it. A person who speaks about what great things he has done or she has done is only showing what little they have done. A person who has truly done something great, he did not do it because he wants to be great, because there was a need to help somebody. He must have done something good. But if you have done with a sincere, a genuine, and a humble heart, that you're doing good to somebody because it is your nature and you're reflecting the nature of God, by doing good, you're showing somebody the God whom you serve. You're not doing good so that others can see you, recognize you, and perhaps reward you in public. Jesus said, when you do good to others with one hand, don't let the other hand know. Don't let and make a show of what little good you do. Don't exalt yourself before others, especially before the king. Self-exaltation certainly is a sign of hypocrisy. Instead, James in chapter 4, verse 10 tells us, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. What a beautiful thought. James, being a very practical apostle, gives us guidelines not to humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. To humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and not to lift yourself up, exalt yourself, but it is God who will exalt you. The reward for humility is being uplifted. And who does that? It is God who does that, not the people in this world, not the great people or the leaders of this world who live according to the standards of this world. Humility, we know, in this world is rarely recognized. But certainly there are good people who will acknowledge and recognize goodness. But if nobody else does, remember, God looks at your humility and he will lift you up. What a wonderful assurance that we have. If you desire to be great and preeminent, that is only a bane to godliness. You try to exalt yourself, you are actually walking in the treading in the path of wickedness. This is just as much as true in this world as it is in the church. In serving God, in serving our fellow human beings, we should show such humility. We cannot be sitting in our ivory towers, high and lifted up, exalting yourself and riding those ivory towers. You will only brought down lower to this earth. We see here a wonderful illustration of what it is to live such a godly life, teaching us humility and modesty. Advising us never to push yourself up to any high status, but always be humble enough to take a lower place, because it is better for the host to see you seated at a lower level and being called up to occupy a higher post or a higher position or a better seat. Instead, if you exalt yourself and you go find a seat among those who are elite than you may be called and say, look, why don't you please give your seat to somebody, and you may be taken to a lower level. That is even more shameful. The message of this wonderful proverb is that if you show pride, self-exaltation, that only leads to shame. But you humble yourself, you will be brought to honor. And this wonderful principle was explained and illustrated by Jesus in a parable that he told of the wedding feast. And Jesus used parables to tell truths very graphically, easy to see and understand. In Proverbs 25, in Jesus talking about this parable, he tells us how important it is to take a position in humility than to be placed placing yourself at a higher place. In this parable of the wedding feast, Jesus told and reminded his disciples how important it is to be humble. For the disciples themselves always debated, and especially in the upper room, if you remember, Jesus saw them debating who will be greater in God's kingdom. Jesus said, if you want to be great in God's kingdom, you have to be a servant. That is what humility is. And Jesus demonstrated that by his very own example. He washed his disciples' feet like a servant. If one of those disciples should have volunteered to wash their others' feet and the feet of Jesus, their master himself shows humility by washing their feet. The disciples saw practically what it is to be truly grateful. To be great in God's kingdom, you have to be a servant of all. And in the parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 14, when you're invited to a wedding feast, do not seek for positions of honor or a place of honor, but who knows, if there is somebody more distinguished than you would come, you would be required to vacate the place and somebody else invited to take that place. But rather, be at a lower position and you will be called up to take a higher position. That is how the humble will be exalted, rather than those who exalt themselves will be put to shame and brought down. Another beautiful illustration of this principle can be seen in the story of Esther. When God's people were in trouble, Esther was reminded by her uncle Mordecai that she is the only one who can save them, and even her very own life was in jeopardy. And Esther, having to meet the king, prepared herself and presented in such humility that she did not rush to make her request to save her and her people, but she waited even for the king to ask. And the king was even willing to give half of his kingdom for Esther. He was so pleased with her life and her behavior. And the king, so delighted, seeing her humility as the queen who could make requests, who could even make demands of her husband. But here she waits. And the king says, what is your request? It shall be given to you even to the half of my kingdom. This is how humility will be rewarded. The king was willing, he loved her so much, and seeing her humility, he was willing to grant her anything. And she was used by God to save her people. But here, in contrast, we have Haman, who boldly asked the king to destroy the Jews, and he was willing to add into the treasury of the king, perhaps a donation or a contribution or whatever, but he was trying to push himself up and trying to get rid of the enemies, his enemies, the Jewish people. And later we see in that story in Esther, when Haman was asked what should be done to honor a man who has saved the king's life, Haman thought, for whom else would this honor be but to me? And he told everything. That person should ride on the king's animal and enjoy the honor that a king gives. And to this, Haman, who wanted his own honor to be elevated, getting rid of his enemies, and especially against Mordecai, who would not bow down to him, finally, his wicked plans were revealed through Esther. And Haman, for his exaltation, self-exaltation, and his acts to destroy his enemies, and his enemy Mordecai would not bow down to him. That same gallows he prepared for Mordecai, he had to be killed. This is how we see Haman, who exalted himself, was not only embarrassed, for he had to take Mordecai walking in front of the animal that he was riding, Mordecai was riding on. The one whom he thought to kill, he had to honor, parading him through the city. This is how we see a person who wants to exalt himself, honor himself, that he would have to face such kind of situations. For self-exaltation and pride and arrogance will lead to one's own downfall. These two verses teach us so clearly that we are to show such humility than self-exaltation, willingness to be counted in the lowest places than to seek for honor, which God alone would bestow. These Proverbs teach us in such clear terms what self-exaltation can do to you. Your boastful nature, pushing for prominent positions, making a self-appraisal of your greatness before a king, assuming that perhaps you are the greatest, only leads to humility and destruction like Haman. But if you choose a humble place, take the lowest seat in the banquet, you may be called upon, exalted in your position, and take a place of honor. We should learn to wait for promotions rather than seek for promotions or such exaltation. In our day-to-day life, in whatever things that we may do, patience is so important, and waiting for such exaltation begins when you start the first rung of humility, for you have to start from the very lowest, then you could climb higher. But if you hop to a higher rung, you have to start at lower levels. For we know this saying, pride goes before a fall. A classic statement, wisdom statement, to avoid our arrogance and shame that comes if you overestimate yourself. There is going to be a fall and shame. And Lucifer is one good example of somebody who's seeing his position higher than the other angels, created in such beauty and glory and splendor. But Lucifer began to let pride and arrogance and even exaltation above God control his life, his thinking, rebelled against God, and finally had to be kicked out of heaven. A covering cherub in the presence of God would now become the arch enemy of God himself. For his pride led to his own fall, and this is certainly true of anyone. That fall may come at any moment, but you continue in your attitude of pride, surely you will face a fall along the way. Instead, true honor we recognize comes when we are recognized for our merits, not one who is demanding higher positions, but one who is willing to humble himself. And so we as God's people, be it in our homes, in our places, workplaces, or in our churches, or in our social gatherings, or in our daily relationships, wherever we may be, always important to acknowledge and accept humility rather than self-exaltation. To let your actions and your character speak than your words. Don't seek for self-promotion, but seek humility and hard work. Certainly that will prevent you embarrassment and give you special respect. This lesson certainly is so vital for us. When we as Christians, God's people, who have before us the great example of Jesus, as Paul says in Philippians 2:5-8, Jesus, who humbled himself, took the form of a servant, leaving his heavenly glory. That great example of Jesus is what should motivate us, inspire us to be humble. He was willing to become even a servant, taking the nature of a sinful human being. He was willing to humble himself and give his life as a ransom for many. So we have wonderful examples in the scriptures, and above all in the life of Christ, the way how we as God's children ought to be humble, willing to suffer, willing to put yourself in lower levels. For if man would not see, God would see us to exalt us. May God bless us today in our activities, in our dealings with one another, that when you find such wonderful opportunity, always willing to humble yourself and to be of service. Others looking at our goodness and our attitude of humility will exalt us. And finally, when we shall hear from our Savior, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into my joy. May God bless each one of us to this end, is my prayer for you. God bless you all.